from other things that are going on this morning. But I really hope you'll give Fletcher your undivided attention for about an hour, a little bit more than an hour. Nothing's going to change much until noon anyway. Because number one,
Ellen, pardon me 1 minute. Try and speak right into your microphone. We're having, it kind of goes away.
Oh, okay, sorry, it's my microphone on my, that better?
Yes, just try and
Good.
stay constant. Don't fall away.
Okay. Fletcher has put an incredible amount of work into his presentations. The first one today and the second one next week. A lot of you have never heard of Fletcher Crowe, but I will tell you, if you go on Google and read everything he's written, he is truly an expert in the migration of the Black community to the Gainesville area. And he has spoken, he's written a number of articles for the Gainesville Sun. I think he wrote one again this Sunday. Correct me if I'm wrong, Fletcher. He has a background, a BA in European history from Stetson University in Florida, and an MA and a PhD in history from Florida State University in Tallahassee. He's taught at Florida Atlantic University in Boca, at Brown University in Gainesville, Georgia, and most recently as an adjunct faculty member in the history department of Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona Beach, which many of you may know is an historically Black university. He retired to Gainesville and was retained by the CRA, the Community Redevelopment Agency of Gainesville, to study the history of Black neighborhoods, Fifth Avenue and Pleasant Street. And he's written articles specifically on that area, which are very informative as well as very entertaining. Fletcher's first talk will focus on what we call the trek of the entire plantation of 100 Black slaves walking to the Gainesville area in 1830 from South Carolina. Then we'll trace the rise of the antebellum King Cotton plantations here and the disaster of the Civil War. This first talk will end with the rise of Jim Crowe and the horrors of invidious segregation in the 19th century before World War I. And again, a lot of this is specific to the Gainesville area. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Fletcher.
Well, thank you, Ellen. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to everybody today. I know we've got some big doings going on at noon, so maybe we can kind of curtail this a little on the early side, and people can slip away and watch CNN and see what's going on in Washington later on. But for an hour here, let's talk about Blacks in the history of Gainesville. You can see right here on this opening slide the markers for Pleasant Street and Fifth Avenue. That is the heart of the Black community in Gainesville, and we'll talk about where that came from. But hold your questions till the end. It's hard for me to see hands going up right now, so we'll have time to talk. And then if anybody wants to stay on, we can certainly stay on longer than an hour. And then next week, we'll finish this and bring the history of Blacks in Gainesville right up to 2021. But today, we're going to stop with Rosewood Massacre in 1923, and also the rise of some of the horrors of the Ku Klux Klan in Gainesville in 1924. So, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, so the sound is okay, and I'll go on. Ellen, let me know if there's any glitch with the presentation, but I'll just move right on here. As she said, here are the topics that we want to talk about today, and then next week we'll talk about blacks in Gainesville in the 20th century, and then right into the 21st century. So she's already talked about some of the things that we're going to talk about, so let's move right on. I know that when everybody here on this course was in high school and college, people always hated to have to learn dates in history class and that sort of thing. So forgive me if I talk about dates in our history program here, but it's kind of talking about dates in history class is kind of like talking about rungs on a ladder. You need rungs on a ladder to be able to figure out where you are. So forgive me. Just to talk about Florida dates here a little bit, you know that the first Spanish came in 1564, and then at the time of the American Revolution, Florida was controlled by the British, and then in 1819, what was Florida was sold to the United States. So that kind of gives us some rungs on our ladder here for a second. But during the American Civil War, we had Florida controlled by the British. And at that time, William Bartram visited Micanopy. Remember, William Bartram was maybe the nation's most famous naturalist. And he actually journeyed over here using Indian trails. And there was no Gainesville at that time, but Micanopy was here. And he was able to see the Indian village in Micanopy. And I think what the takeaway for this course is that Chief Micanopy had over 100 black slaves. And these were black people that had escaped from plantations north of Florida, that is, Georgia and so forth, and had made their way into Indian territory. And they were living under Indian control. But the blacks really preferred living under Indian control rather than Spanish control or white control, because the Indians treated them a lot better. You can see these little red triangles along the Spanish Trail through North Florida. That's where Spanish missions were. But Spain was sold to Florida in 1819, as I said. And of course, the Spanish missions disappeared. But of course, the blacks remained. And then after the Second Seminole War in the 1830s, we saw the end of Indians in North Florida. So let's move on a little bit here. If you got some questions and all, just jot them down on a note or something like that. Put them in the margin, and we'll get back to your questions after we finish this little formal part of the presentation. Okay, if I can make this darn thing, there we go. Okay, now you can imagine that the white slave owners in places like Georgia and Alabama hated to have their slaves slip away at night and come down into Florida. So in 1818, General Andrew Jackson and his troops came through North Florida. And if you can see on this map on slide 4, you can see the little arrows as to where his troops went to try to round up escaped slaves. You can see that they got east as far as the Swanee River in 1818, but then came back west. And then, as you know, there was the Battle of New Orleans later on. But basically, he was trying to round up blacks that had run away as escaped slaves. And there was no Gainesville at that time, but there certainly were the plantations, and the blacks were sent back to their masters in many cases. Now, if you know anything at all about cotton plantations, you know that cotton reduces the fertility of the soil. So cotton plantations in places like South Carolina got increasingly less fertile, and the cotton plantation owners were looking for new virgin land where they could grow cotton and then sell that cotton in Britain or in England, especially Manchester, where it was manufactured and sold into cloth. So the lands in what we think of as North Florida after 1819 were virgin lands, and that attracted great plantation owners into what you could think of as Gone with the Wind, Florida. Now, there were a lot of plantations here in Alachua County, but in this little presentation, I thought we could just look at three of them, three that you might be interested in here this morning. The first one's the Bailey Plantation, and we're going to see a picture of the Bailey House, which still exists over on 6th Street, that you may have seen. And we're going to be talking about Serenola, which is very close to Oak Hammock. It's just walking distance to Oak Hammock. The house is gone, but the historical marker is there. And if you take a stroll out on Williston Road, you have read the historical marker. And then, of course, Hale Plantation. And I'm sure a lot of the people here listening to this presentation have been through the Hale Plantation. So let's take a look at some of the plantations. Now, remember that Gainesville itself wasn't established until 1854. So these plantations came well before there was a Gainesville. Here's a picture that I took of the Bailey Plantation House. It's not in historical preservation right now, so it's owned by commercial interests. So you can't really go through it. We really should preserve this. It's probably the first structure that was built in this area that's still existent. It was used as a preschool, I think, for a while. I'm not sure what it is now, but anyway, if you're over on 6th Street, you'll see the historical marker, so you can pull right over there in the parking lane and then read the historical marker right on 6th Street. It was built about 1850 by James Bailey, who brought his slaves down with him from South Carolina to run a cotton plantation. The structure's on the National Register of Historic Places, as you can imagine, and certainly it's still very much there, but you don't see the slave quarters in the back anymore. Now, did I miss one here? Yeah, no, here's a Hale Plantation. If we were all in the same room, I'd ask you to raise your hand if you've been through the Hale Homestead before, but as you know, it's quite a tourist attraction here. And it was built in the 1850s when so many of these big cotton plantations moved into the Alachua area. And some of you may remember actually partying there. It was used as a party house in the 20th century. And if you grew up in Gainesville, you may have gone out there to do various things. But anyway, it's historical structure that is still there. And you can get an idea of what the life for slaves was like. Did you ever see the movie 12 Years a Slave? That came out, what, a couple of years ago, I believe. Just horrific life for the terrible life of the slaves in those days. But you can get a glimpse today by walking through that Hale Plantation house. And now Serenola. Serenola is just walking distance from Oak Hammock. You know, it's down on the corner of 34th and Williston Road. It was built in 1857. Remember, the Civil War started in 1860, so it was just before the Civil War. And if I'm not mistaken, the grounds that are Oak Hammock today were part of Serenola Plantation. I think I'm right about that, but I'm not sure exactly where the boundary line was. In any case, in the 1860 census, Serenola was listed as having 120 slaves. But what is, to me, what's very interesting is that after the Civil War, the plantation was actually owned by a veteran of the 54th Massachusetts. Now, if you remember the movie Glory was about the 54th Massachusetts, which was the colored infantry. And if you remember, those people were slaughtered. just utterly slaughtered, massacred in South Carolina with the attack of a fort there. If you want to see that film again, I'm sure you can get it from Netflix or something. It's a very fine film, but of course it's incredibly gruesome that these people, these black people, were just taken to their death during the Civil War. But the Serenola Plantation was actually broken up and sold to black people who had been on that plantation. And actually some of the black people had lived right into, I think, as I recall, 1949. So we think of that as, you know, pre-Civil War and all that, but really it comes right into our own lives and our own understanding here in Alachua County. And it's just a couple blocks from Ocama. Well, if you remember, the Civil War was 1860 to 1865. And if you remember from 10th grade in high school, the Unions had blockaded the ports along the Atlantic. And of course, they blockaded Fernandina, which was the big port on the Atlantic for Florida. And then the Union troops moved west from Fernandina and got as far as Ocean Pond, which is north of us here. It's not in Alachua County, but just a little bit north. And you can, of course, visit the site of the Ocean Pond battle today. The blacks in Alachua County, of course, were terribly treated during the Civil War. In 1860, the census showed 40 slaves actually in Gainesville. Gainesville had been created, you know, in 1854, very shortly before the Civil War, and there were several, I guess 4 that were listed as free blacks. Now that's 4 out of 40, that's 10%. In some cities in the South at the time of the Civil War, you had a good deal higher percentage of freed blacks, but not in Gainesville. It was 10% in 1860. Now, if you recall, after the Civil War, Congress enacted Reconstruction with the Freedmen's Bureau. And as far as Gainesville was concerned, what happened was that there was a school for young black boys and girls called Union Academy that was built here in Gainesville. Here's a picture of it as a 2-story building. The next picture I'll show is the building is a 1-story building, the original structure, but they added the 2nd story on there. The teachers, they had 2 white teachers. They were young women from New England, and they were provided by an anti-slavery society. They were not paid for by, let's say, the school system of Alachua County, as we would think of today. But we actually have the records of these white women, and they were very excited. They were very encouraged. They said these young black kids really wanted to learn and were going to be learning. I think you know that before the Civil War, it was very, very illegal to allow a black person to read. So all of these freed black slaves were illiterate. But a school like this, of course, was a major step forward in literacy for black students. So the next picture I've got here, here's the original structure right here. The structure was what we think of as downtown, rather near Main Street, just a little west of Main Street. Of course, it doesn't exist any longer, but this is what it looked like. I believe that the woman on the porch there in this picture was one of those 2 women from New England that I mentioned, whose records we have of what it was like teaching in a place like Gainesville right after the Civil War. Well, as Ellen said when we began this session today, in the 1880s, a large number of black people actually walked to Gainesville from South Carolina. You can believe that living in a place like South Carolina as a freed slave must have been a horrendous existence, because you were shoulder to shoulder with the people who had mistreated you so badly. for all those years, but you were free, essentially with very little income and very little future. So the black people in Camden, South Carolina, were encouraged by anti-slavery groups in the North to actually migrate to a place like Gainesville. And they came down as free people, some in wagons, most walking, and actually were able to buy property. They were able to get loans, so to speak, and actually become property owners. And the location of the black community that was established at that time is what we today here in Gainesville think of as Fifth Avenue, Pleasant Street. You know that Sweet Berry's restaurant is at Fifth Avenue on 13th, and so this is just east of Sweet Berry's. You remember the old 706 restaurant, which is closed now, is north of 706 restaurant, right in there, and a very vibrant black community was established. And one of the ways that they were able to establish this is by getting loans to actually become property owners, landowners. And the money was made available for them to actually buy the property. So here is a picture I took of one of the original structures. This particular house is on 8th, which is just west of the police station. And this type of structure was called a shotgun house, and because it was said that you could shoot a shotgun right through the center of it and never hit anybody, because you had a sort of a breezeway right coming through the center of the structure, and you could have a family living on one end, another family on the other end. The people that came down from South Carolina had all sorts of trades, so it was really quite remarkable. You see here on slide 13 the kinds of trades that the people had. Let me just read some of these. This is really something. The black people that moved into Gainesville at that time were tailors, blacksmiths, shoemakers, carpenters, teamsters, bakers, barbers, painters, ministers, musicians, cobblers, doctors, all sorts of people. So we know, of course, that a lot of the freed slaves had been cotton pickers, basically, essentially, uneducated and illiterate. But you can see that these people were artisans. They had the skill set that really was able to build a town. Here's a picture. I didn't take this earlier. This is a picture of two of those structures that were built in the 1880s. You know that downtown on University, we have the Blunt Center, which is a part of the Santa Fe College. These structures were torn down to build the parking lot for Santa Fe College. It's a shame because these have real historical value, but you can see how big this one structure is here in the foreground. You can see it was essentially one room, but this is the kind of structure that was built by the blacks that had walked down from South Carolina. So these are gone now. What happened after the Civil War to build Gainesville, as you probably know, was the railroads came through Gainesville, and particularly the Atlantic Coast Railroad came from the north, right straight through the city on what is today Main Street, just bifurcating the city. And what happened there was that actually tore apart the black community that we've been talking about here. And I took a picture of these tracks. They still exist. You can see right here on Main Street. If you look for them, they're right there. And you can see the picture here on slide 15 of what it was like in those days. The train would come right through the center of town. The reason that I wanted to talk about the railroad at this time was because a lot of the railroad workers were black, and they had to have a place to stay. And so a rooming house was built that would allow blacks to stay there. And we'll talk about that rooming house next time, you know, a week from today in the second half of the lecture. You probably remember that at the end of the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was enacted. And as part of the 14th Amendment, it was outlawed for a person that had joined an insurrection against the government of the United States to hold office. So of course that meant that white officers, white soldiers from the South were forbidden to hold office, federal office. So of course that meant that large numbers of blacks became office holders, and of course that meant that a lot of carpetbaggers from the North moved down to places like Gainesville, and because they were not forbidden to hold office. Well, what happened in Gainesville was that Josiah T Walls, a black man, was able to be the member of the House of Representatives for Alachua County in Congress for 3 terms. And as you know, a representative holds the office for 2 years, so that means he served in Congress in Washington for 6 years. Now, he was a farmer here in Alachua County in what we think of as downtown Gainesville now, but he was a successful farmer. And later he moved over to Tallahassee and taught agriculture at the Florida A&M, which you know is a historically black university. So he's very famous and nationally famous. And you know, there's a historical marker commemorating his life and achievements right on university. So if you haven't read that, the next time you're downtown, it's on the north side of the street, and I want you to stop and read the Josiah T Walls historical marker. He's quite a character. But the white people in Gainesville, Alachua County, and across the South were embittered that the blacks had all that newfound power after the Civil War, and so you saw the rise of Jim Crowe. Now, my last name is Crowe, spelled with an E, and I don't take any credit for being associated with Jim Crowe, but you can see the term Jim Crow came from this character that we see here, a cartoonish character, very derisive picture of a drawing. The Jim Crow laws were awful. They were terrible. But the Supreme Court of the United States upheld separate but equal in the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896. So it was the law of the land. And, you know, this is where the whole idea of blacks sitting in the back of the bus came, and all sorts of other invidious discrimination. What was particularly harmful for the blacks was the poll tax, which is now illegal. But in those days, the poll tax maybe didn't sound like a lot of money, but it was enough to keep blacks from voting. So that sort of ended this era of Walls and black representation. Now, at this time, with separate but equal, what we see, of course, is the construction of black structures by blacks for blacks using black labor. Here in Alachua County, one of those chief architectural items was Mount Carmel Baptist Church. And here's a picture of what it really looked like after the Civil War. It no longer exists. And we have a Mount Carmel Baptist Church downtown on 5th Avenue, but of course it's a much newer structure. And here's a picture of the historical marker that marks that church. And we'll talk more about the history of that church in the lecture next time. But here's what the original structure looked like. Now I'd like to spend just a few minutes here about talking about this structure right here. After the Civil War, some structures for education of blacks were built. And here is one of them that's real close to Oak Hammock. This is the Liberty Hills School, which still exists. I took this picture. It's just a mile or two from Oak Hammock. You can see it's still vertical. It's in pretty bad dilapidated condition, but But you know, Okamek people could go over and give it a coat of paint or something. This is an original schoolhouse for blacks to be able to read and write, and it still exists. It's just not very far from Okamek, and if anybody's interested in the address, I can send it to you later on. It's in the lot of the Liberty Hill Baptist Church. It's sort of behind the church, but you can see it actually when you're on 23rd heading west to go to Santa Fe. You can see it on your right on the north side of 23rd. But this era that we're talking about right now, the Jim Crow era, was really, really sad. There are 46 cases of recorded lynchings in Alachua County, lynchings of black people before World War II. Just terrible. Here on, you can see on slide 20, as I think I have some of them listed right here. The worst case of lynching that I'm aware of is the lynching of 6 blacks in Newberry in 1916. You can actually visit the headstones of these blacks that were lynched. It's not that far from Okamek. If you go out Newberry Road toward Newberry, you'll see the sign for the Pleasant Plain United Methodist Church on the north side of the road, and you just turn in, go north. As if you're headed west, you go to the right, and the church is right there, just north of Newberry Road, and the little cemetery is right there before the church, and you can actually stand there and see the headstones of these people that were lynched by white mob 1916. Luckily today we have the Alachua County Community Remembrance Project with Jackie Davis to commemorate the horror of these lynchings, especially the lynching in Newberry. That group was instrumental in getting the historical marker to commemorate the deaths of these people. But I would encourage anybody at Okamek to drive over there. It's just a few minutes away, and stand there and look at those headstones and think of what white people did to these black people during World War I. Well, you remember that World War I ended in 1919, but in the early 1920s, right after World War I, we saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And of course, that was throughout the nation, actually, more than just the South. The Ku Klux Klan was pretty strong in Indiana and Ohio, but it was very strong right here in Gainesville. One of the worst episodes of the Klan here was not necessarily against blacks, it was actually against Catholics. They hated Catholics as much as they hated black people. But in 1924, which is shortly after World War I, the Klansmen here in Gainesville abducted a University of Florida faculty member who was Catholic, Father Connolly, and they beat him, castrated him, and dumped him in a Catholic church over in Palatka. The Gainesville chief of police at that time was actually implicated in the doings of the Klan. And so the Klan was, at least in some ways, tolerated, although perhaps on the sly. But it was a terrible time, and you can imagine if they did that to a white person, think what they were doing to black people. And there are recorded incidences of the Klan attacking black people here in Gainesville. But the worst tragedy of all at that time was Rosewood. You know that when you drive down to Cedar Key, say for dinner or to see some water down at Cedar Key, about an hour outside of Gainesville on the left, on the south side of the road, is the historical marker for Rosewood. And if you ever saw the movie Rosewood, you know that in 1923, angry white crowd, a mob, burned down the structures that were inhabited by black people in the little town of Rosewood. And lots of black people were massacred. And like I say, if you saw that movie, you know that the train stopped at Rosewood. And what happened was that black parents, adults, herded little black children to the railroad station. And the white conductor was willing to allow these blacks to get on the white train. And the black children were brought here to Gainesville. They got off at the station here in Gainesville, and their lives were saved. Some of those kids are still alive today, and they've written books about what it was like to be in the Rosewood Massacre of 1923. So you may have actually seen some of those books or been to some lectures by some of the survivors of the Rosewood Massacre. But it was a terrible, terrible tragedy. And you can imagine the horror of those little kids as they grew up, thinking that at any time they could be the recipients of that kind of terrible, atrocious mob behavior. Well, that's all I have in this formal part of this presentation right now. Next week in this course, we'll talk about Gainesville in the 1920s with the blacks and the Ku Klux Klan. And then we'll look at Gainesville blacks during World War II, and then immediately after World War II, like with the Cotton Club and so forth. And then we'll talk a little about Gainesville during the Civil Rights era. But in this course, we have Mike Gingler, who will talk about the Civil Rights era and desegregation. So I'll kind of go easy on that because you don't want to have two lectures about the same thing. And then we'll talk about blacks in Gainesville in the 21st century and that sort of thing. So Ellen, that's the end of my formal presentation, but I really would be happy to stay around here as long as we're not watching an inauguration and answer any questions that people might have, okay?
Well, Fletcher, that was a wonderful presentation. It really is a great overview of what happened in this area and the migration of blacks to this community, and also the suffering that they went through. I don't think anybody really realizes how many lynchings were in Gainesville, but there were plenty to count, more than plenty to count. I'd be interested in the comments of some of the people who are online and have been watching this. I know, I don't think we've had anything in the chat box, but if you want to ask a question or you want to make a comment, please raise your hand. I think Fletcher's done a really terrific job. Annalise?
Fletch, the people who came down from South Carolina, were they original Africans or were they born in the US already?
Well, that's a great question. They came down in the 1880s. It had been illegal to import people from Africa starting in 1830. So anybody alive in the 1880s would have been at least second generation. In the British Empire, the importation of slaves was stopped in 1807, which was even before the United States. So we know that there were a few slaves brought in illegally. You slipped in, in the middle of the night into Biloxi, Mississippi or something. But no, the importation of slaves had really, for the most part, stopped in 1830 in the United States.
Thank you.
Rick Gold, go ahead.
Thanks for a great presentation. A few years ago, I was doing some election canvassing in Alachua and found a school that was supported by Julius Rosenwald in a black neighborhood of Alachua. I was wondering if you could talk about that and whether there are other schools funded by Rosenwald in Alachua County, including Gainesville.
That's a new one on me. No, I don't know that. Let me just open that up just a little bit for the people that are listening here. we think of Gainesville here, but actually before there was Gainesville, the first white community, was in what we think of as Alachua, which was Noonanville at the time earlier, which predates Alachua. And then the railroad, the Cross Florida Railroad from Cedar Key across to the other side of the state came through just before the Civil War, and so it was going to miss Noonanville, and so a number of the structures that were in Noonanville got physically moved to what we think of as Gainesville. They, put them on wagons and wheeled them down to the railroad, which they knew was going to be the new way to get your crops to market. So no, I don't know those schools at all. Sorry.
Are you going to speak next week about the Porters community, the railroad Porters, which is south of Main Street?
Well, I was going to mention it. You and probably a lot of people here today know that we have several different communities in Gainesville that have been historically Black. Porters is one of them. The Fifth Avenue, Pleasant Street area, of course, is another. And during the time of segregation, where you had such a very strong prohibition against Black people living near white people, these Black communities grew up, and they became literally a town within a town. It's hard for us today to even conceptualize that, but you, in a place like Porter's or at Fifth Avenue, you have a whole town that's basically roped off from the other parts of town. A town like that has its own hospital, has its own library, has its own funeral homes, has its own churches, has its own drugstore, has its own everything. And yeah, Porter's actually has historical preservation status now as a properly protected area.
Any other comments or questions?
Well, if not, we'll let you get back to what's really on your mind today. But I appreciate the presentation by Fletch really very much. He's put a lot of work into this. And I am sure that most of you on the Zoom call have learned things that you did not know about this area. I know I certainly did when I started working with him and started reading some of his articles. But this area, not just Gainesville, but Alachua County, is just rich in Black history, and and unfortunately the slavery that came with it. So I look forward to his talk next week, and if no one else has any questions, we'll leave the presentation for today. Thank you again, Fletch.
Well, I'm going to hang around here if anybody wants to chat or kibitz or ask questions or talk about what emotional impact hearing these stories have. So I'll just stay here if anybody wants to talk.
Julia, there's a couple of questions in the chat box. Did we go through those?
Well, they were comments made to everyone. One says there's a Rosenwald School of Micanopy. Perhaps an additional piece of information, Alachua County was a Black majority county from 1860 through 1910. They're not really questions, they're comments.
Okay. All right, well, we're good. Fletch, we're gonna leave the meeting, which means you sort of just can't hang around. But if anybody has any questions about the presentation today, when you think about it and you go through his PowerPoint, this is being recorded, please feel free to raise those issues next week.